Doowan is a strategic advisor to the Institute for Security and Technology and adjunct professor of politics at the University of San Francisco. Working at a Silicon Valley tech company, he also leverages emerging AI technologies to empower open society and support to national security. So without any further ado, I'd like to turn it over to an old friend of mine, Mr. Doowan Lee. So Doowan, over to you. We will get your slides up and get sharing here in a second. Over to you,
All
sir.
right. First of all, thank you so much for having me, Lumpy, and also APCSS. Unlike my illustrious colleagues, I'm just a humble support element. But I do think, I have done some meaningful work, especially in the information environment in the past 10, 15 years. And the overall purpose of my talk is twofold. First, I want to sort of, appreciate the volume and scale of disinformation employed in support of adversarial information operations, especially from the Chinese Communist Party, the Kremlin, the Iranian regime, and of course, the KJU regime in the DPRK. And the second purpose of my presentation is a little bit more philosophical and if not intellectual, and that is, I really want us to share this urgency, right? That we need to get into this fight, we need to get into this fray. And let me share a personal anecdote to sort of accentuate why this urgency is so critical for us to factor in right now. So I've been teaching deterrence and strategy for the past 15 years in various roles. I remember the first time I took a class with some of the well-known IR theorists at the University of Chicago about 15 years ago. And back then, we were going through different variants of international relations. And one of them was the power transition theory. And back then, most analysts and some of the best scholars we had, they all predicted that there is no way the Chinese Communist Party would be able to overtake us until the 22nd century, right? Fast forward about 5 years, I'm teaching my first class on deterrence and grand strategy at the Naval Postgraduate School. And now, people are saying that, well, the Chinese Communist Party may overtake us by 2075. And now fast forward 5 years again, and I'm teaching deterrence again. And at MPS, most of my students were Special Operations Forces, officers. And a lot of them were talking about the early 2010s. A lot of them were coming from Iraq, some of them coming from other countries, conflict, torn countries. And I remember telling them, hey, what do you think will threaten our national security the most, right? And of course, everybody was talking about, wow, it's going to be, violent extremists, movements, right? Perhaps, Russia a little bit because now Putin is trying to make a comeback, right? And I mentioned hey, what about China? China is growing fast, right? And I remember a lot of these, students were just laughing at me, right? And that is, there's no way China will be able to overtake us anytime soon. Now, fast forward 5 more years, and I was reading a report published by the UK-based, Center for Economic and Business Research. And, it really pains me to share this, bit of information, and that is because of the COVID pandemic, right? Doesn't matter, which side of the political spectrum you belong to, right? But it is a true statement that the Chinese economy is coming out of this pandemic much better than we are, right? And now the CEBR is predicting that the Chinese economy is more likely to overtake our own economy by 2028. That is 7 years from now on, right? So in 7 years, we need to figure something out. And, people talk about great power competition and how we should employ, different instruments of national power to impose, disproportionate costs on the Chinese Communist Party to ensure that we are not overtaken in 7 years, right? I think that brings me back to the cyber and information environment, right? And think about essentially in what ways we can reestablish our position in the global system that we have built and maintained in the past 75 years. So to me, this is what is really at stake, right? And, I have 2 kids and, I have a wife and I have this, very, very dreadful scenario in terms of what kind of world they may live, right? If the CCP, becomes the true hegemon, right? So to me, sharing this urgency is really perhaps the most important part of my presentation. And slide, please. With that, let me share some, slide. Let me share some, basic sort of, dynamics of what's happening in the information environment right now. Slide, please. Lumpy, slide, please.
Yep, we're working on it. I think a little bit of a delay on the slide.
That's fine. That's fine. And just a couple of ground rules. Please, feel free to interrupt me. Please feel free to unmute yourself to ask many questions or comments. Nothing bores me more than monotonic presentations, so I do not want to impose that predicament on you, and I want this conversation to be as interactive as possible.
So, Doowan, I'm looking at your slide that says, "What is disinformation?" Is that the correct slide?
Can we push one more slide forward?
Okay, we'll push one more.
Yeah, so let me share some key dynamics, right? In terms of how disinformation is being, widely employed as part of adversarial information operations. And let me start with what has not changed. And to me, information has always been an integral part of, warfare. Give me one historical example where propaganda was not used, right? Give me one an ancient war where storytelling was not involved, right? So information has always been an integral part of warfare. I don't think that has changed a bit, right? However, I would offer 3 characteristics that really define where things are right now. So I call them scale, asymmetry, and predominance, right? Let me start with the scale first. So slide, there are some hidden animation here, Lumpy. So let me show some key statistics. So this is what we call monthly active users, right? So Facebook in a month about 2.7 billion, not million, billion active users. WhatsApp 2 billion, right? And you can see the numbers, right? We talked about massive numbers. I want you to pay particular attention to WeChat, TikTok, Tencent, and Weibo. These are all Chinese-based social media applications or platforms, right? WeChat, about 1.2 billion. TikTok, 800 million, right? Tencent is close to 700 million. Sina Weibo, close to 600 million, right? And you can see that we're talking about a lot of users active on various social media platforms. And of course, if you go down the list, you will see VK, which is essentially the Facebook of the Russian Federation, also is being widely used in Eastern Europe and whatnot, right? So we're talking about a lot of data points, and just to give you an example, if I'm analyzing Chinese disinformation campaigns online, if I'm ingesting a lot of data points, we're looking about 5 to 7 trillion inferences a day, right? So what I'm trying to tell you here is that there is no way we can hand jam this volume of information to sort what is true, what is not true, what is disruptive, what is not, essentially distorted, and so on and so forth. So to me, like, the scale and the volume of information coming out of especially the Chinese Communist Party, right? It's become so massive, right? I talk to our forward deployed elements, routinely, right? Especially with our IO specialized team cells and whatnot, right? And we're all struggling because we're so used to relying on human analysts to process information and then turning it into intelligence. With this kind of volume, there's just no way we can hand jam it, right? So again, this is really overwhelming. But that's not all, that matters to me, right? Because, this volume, this scale, is not symmetrical at all, right? And you can imagine, the CCP, the Kremlin, they can all roam freely on Western social media. But if you look at VKs, now Weibo, WeChat, right? And so on and so forth, we cannot access those social media platforms as freely as the CCP or the Kremlin can access our social media platforms. So it creates a massive level of asymmetry. So they can essentially walk around in our information backyard, right? Plan things, right? Do whatever they want, right? However, we cannot essentially return the favor. I'm not advocating for censorship, right? But this information environment is inherently asymmetrical and skewed at this point, right? And let me share some more data points to accentuate this point. And that is, I've been tracking a lot of CCP outlets and CCP affiliated, essentially social media accounts over the years. And I'm doing the same thing with Kremlin accounts as well as Kremlin affiliated media outlet. So about 12 months ago, right, on a daily basis, CCP, related essentially accounts would get about, 15,000 mentions a day, right? So I think that was the volume of CCP content that we'd be able to see on a daily basis on Western social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, Instagram, and whatnot, right? And imagine, right, what that number might be right now, and that is actually close to 200,000, right? So it has increased, more than 10 times in 12 months, right? So that is, their presence on our information backyard has gone up dramatically, right? And of course, our limited access to their information environment remains the same, right? Same thing with the Kremlin or Kremlin affiliated media outlets that essentially went up by at least 10 times in the past 12 months. And of course, we can all relate to this, right? We've seen tons of disinformation campaigns coming from the CCP and the Kremlin about the coronavirus, right? And now I think all the rage is about different vaccines to treat the COVID pandemic. And this is an ongoing process right now, and the volume is only going to go up, right? And there is a very messy kind of graphic on the right bottom quadrant. And that is essentially a picture of different bots supporting Chinese propaganda. And this is also really interesting because now, we used to hear about, 50-cent army, right? Essentially, the Chinese Communist Party would employ a large number of troll farms to support their own propaganda, mostly for internal law and order, purposes, right? Now, they still have the same, troll farms, right? But now they are supported by large numbers of bots, botnets and etc., or syndicated networks. Essentially, they can outpace, our counter messages because they employ a lot of automated accounts or processes. And this is perhaps why, we are not competing effectively against the CCP, especially in the information environment. And the last characteristic is what I call the predominance of the information environment. And, what are some of the typical domains in which we compete against the revisionist regimes? So typically we say, land, sea, air, space, human, cyber, and information, right? And every time I teach, deterrence or talk to senior DoD, leaders, I always ask them, how regularly do we face national security threats in the land, sea, air, space domains, right? And frankly, yes, they can be very, visible. They can be very conspicuous, but perhaps not very regularly, right? It's not very frequent, right? And then I asked them, how regularly do we face national security threats in the information domain and in the cyber domain? Every day, right? Every hour, every minute, if not every second. So to me, really the information environment has become the main battleground for great power competition, right? And again, going back to the urgency that I mentioned earlier, imagine that we need to essentially reverse this asymmetry on short order, right? In the next 2 or 3 years. I don't think, we can neglect the cyber domain or the information domain if we want to impose disproportional cost, especially on the Chinese Communist Party. Those equations are just really hard to calculate in the traditional warfighting domains like land, sea, air, and space. But I do think that the cyber domain and the information domain provide some interesting opportunities for us. Slide. So, I want to highlight some of the key developments that have taken place in the past 12 months, especially with CCP propaganda. And I see four key characteristics. So number one, I think they're using this information in a much more strategically aligned fashion. So, the Chinese Communist Party has always used information as part of its, political monopoly, right? But it was mostly internally focused and perhaps to suppress protest movements, right? Or perhaps essentially to elevate its legitimacy among the Chinese population. What has happened since 2020 is somewhat different. I see a lot of Chinese disinformation employed to support their long-term strategic narratives, such as the inevitable decline of Pax Americana. So how much disinformation the Chinese Communist Party has used to essentially falsely amplify the narrative that the US government has failed to protect its citizens from the coronavirus. Also, I think, they are attacking the very notion of liberal democracy. I mean, it was always part of their staple, right? But since 2020, it has become one of the main and persistent themes they've been pushing out to the rest of the world. Number two, they become much more externally focused than before, right? I told you that a lot of CCP and CCP affiliated accounts have become at least 10 times more active in the past 12 months, right? So essentially they are targeting liberal democracies. And of course, we are on top of their target list, right? So it used to be very internally focused, but now it is completely focused on how to shape the rest of the world. Number three, as I mentioned earlier, they've become much more proficient at leveraging what we call artificial amplification. Messaging is, requires some good content, right? But if you can speak faster, if you can speak louder, right, you can typically drone out alternative viewpoints or alternative narratives. And of course, the Kremlin has honed this skill set much better than anybody else. And of course, I do see a lot of evidence that suggests that the CCP has employed a lot of the same TTPs that the Kremlin has used in the past, but at a much higher level, right? So again, until 2019, I didn't see a lot of bots, trolls, sock puppets, or hijack accounts supporting CCP propaganda, and that it has completely changed in the past 12 months. Number four, the Chinese Communist Party used to go it alone when it comes to information warfare. So they didn't really coordinate with any other governments or regimes in the past. What has become really peculiar in the past 12 months is that, if you follow what is coming out of the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, right? There is a palpable level of coordination between the Chinese Communist Party and the Kremlin, between the CCP and the Iranian regime. In fact, I see the Xinhua News Agency or CGTN, right, or the Global Times carrying content from Press TV all the time. Press TV is a well-known propaganda outlet for the Iranian regime, right? And also we see a lot of coordination between the CCP and the Maduro regime in Venezuela. And of course, Duterte is no exception in the regard. So, the bottom line here is that, at least from my viewpoint, the Chinese Communist Party has determined that they can hurt us the most in the information environment. And sadly, I don't think we have showed up to essentially, play the game yet, right? Slide. And I can sort of, summarize about 5 key information warfare campaigns that we've seen from the Chinese Communist Party, right? So, initially it started with essentially obfuscating the origin of the coronavirus, right? And also vilifying their own citizen journalists who are trying to improve public health in Wuhan and the rest of China, right? And then it quickly moved on to essentially, perhaps this was the watershed moment when Zhao Ziyan, who is a spokesperson for the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, started disseminating blatant conspiracy theories about the origin of the coronavirus, right? Essentially, the US Army inserted this virus into Wuhan 2019 October, right? And the CIA was behind it. And it was really almost surreal to see, party officials disseminating, blatantly, misleading and falsified conspiracy theories targeting essentially, us and our government. And that just continued on, to the third campaign, which was essentially using COVID aid, right? Essentially using the kind of, PR stunts to show that liberal democracies have failed to look after their own citizens from the pandemic, right? And this just goes on and on and on. And then we see a lot of linkage to, why, people shouldn't support the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. And of course, why this is necessary for the CCP to look after the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, Mongolia, and whatnot. And of course, when you are winning, you continue to scale up and you continue to experiment with, more aggressive information operations. And I think this is what we've seen in the past 6 months. And that is essentially, we've seen strong indications that the Chinese Communist Party was using its diaspora networks to essentially send subtle messages designed to sow discord and chaos in our election, right? And of course, they continue to do so with every bit of political instability in our country. So so this really brings me to this, central, point, and that is, because we haven't really pushed back very hard in the past, 12 or 14 months, the Chinese Communist Party has really elevated its information warfare against us. And, this is not stopping. I check the amount of CCP content on Western social media on a regular basis, and the volume is going up, it's not going down, right? And just to give you a sense of the scale, right? About a week ago, YouTube took down 3,000 channels, right? Not 3,000 videos. I'm talking about 3,000 channels, each with perhaps 100 or more video clips, right? So we're talking about some massive, massive video content, right? And YouTube decided to take down 3,000 channels. because they thought they were affiliated with either Chinese propaganda or Russian propaganda, right? So that was, big news, right? Out of those 3,000 channels, 2,946 of them was supporting Chinese propaganda, right? And we're talking about a lot of English-speaking channels, right? Designed to essentially influence our population and whatnot, right? And of course, in the Western Hemisphere. So, like I said in the beginning, they're literally roaming freely, right? And they're injecting all kinds of disinformation in our information environment, right? Because to me, this is really an essential aspect of competition, what we call great power competition, right? A great power that is internally disturbed and internally fragmented cannot compete effectively, right? And I think this has been this is nothing new, right? Active measures started during the Cold War era, right? In fact, the word disinformation is kind of has a funny origin because Stalin coined the term disinformatia in the early 50s, right? So this is nothing new, right? However, what worries me is that again, I'm an empiricist, so let me share some more stats right now. So how big is our economy? What is our an annual GDP? Well, it's about 21.5 trillion, right? People are scared of the Kremlin. Look, the Russian economy is about 1.6 trillion a year, right? It's smaller than that of Texas, right? The Chinese economy is a different story. It's about 15.3 trillion at this point. And that scares me, right? Because imagine essentially, the Kremlin's TTPs, right? In terms of, subversion and sabotage in the cyber domain and the information domain, right? But imagine, Beijing that has about 10 times as much resourcing to do that, right? And I think this is why, I am somewhat, terrified of the prospect of, how this fight in the information environment may pan out if we don't push it back really, really hard, right? And we cannot bomb it away, right? I mean, we can take down servers, right? Perhaps we can send cyber bombs to, some troll farms, right? But that's not going to make a dent on the CCP's information machinery, so to speak. So again, I think this is where we stand, right? And later on, I promise you, I will share some uplifting examples as well. But I just want to share where the real fight is taking place at this point. Slide. And of course, this is a quick snapshot of how the Kremlin has used disinformation in the past 12 months, right? And essentially, in terms of the key, processes and mechanisms, they're very comparable, right? Using a lot of syndicated news networks, right? Using a lot of bots, a lot of trolls, and essentially automated accounts to essentially, be able to spread your own story faster than anybody else, right? So I still guest lecture for different elements in our soft enterprise. So whenever I teach PsyOp, guys or gals, I always tell them, three things. You want to say it first, say it loud, and say it often, and that's how you win in the information environment. And the Kremlin has, cracked the code on that notion, right? They are really good at essentially. They don't care about the content. They don't care how ridiculous, right, or how far-fetched the content may be. But it's really about the speed of dissemination and amplification, right? And I think this is where essentially what we call computational propaganda has taken the center stage of information warfare. And of course, what's really interesting is, how essentially the Kremlin has become more like a second fiddle to the CCP, especially in the past 12 months. And I see the Kremlin essentially following, the CCP's main talking points and amplifying them. Again, sometimes they're very much aligned, right? In terms of falsely amplifying the notion of the decline of liberal democracy, right? Why do they do it? Actually, it's very simple, right? If liberal democracies fail, then pro-democracy movements in their own countries will have nothing to look forward to, right? And this is how they maintain their political monopoly, right? But at the same time, there is an additional element that is truly troubling to me, and that is both the CCP and the Kremlin are trying to undermine, liberal multilateral institutions, very aggressively, right? So I see them supporting all kinds of exit movements, Brexit, Italy exit, right? All sorts of essentially hashtag exit movements, right? Because they realize that, hey, if we can undermine, liberal multilateral institutions, it's just so much easier to essentially co-opt them one at a time, right? And we already see this happening in the Balkans, right? We already see this in several, smaller European countries. Greece is a good example, right? I think, a lot of us remember that the European Union was trying to pass a resolution to condemn, how essentially the CCP is harvesting human organs from political, prisoners and whatnot, right? And of course, Greece received a lot of, aid. In fact, they're building a major port in Greece with CCP money. And of course, they essentially was the only country that essentially rejected the resolution. And because it's based on consensus, right, the resolution couldn't move forward. And we see this indication essentially, divide and conquer, right? The oldest trick in the book, so to speak, right? The more they undermine the global, liberal international order that we have built and maintained and expanded, right? They are essentially on a mission to destroy that whole construct. So, slide. So, that's a lot of, big sort of, patterns and dynamics. And then, let me talk, let me get a little bit more tactical and share some of my own, research. And again, this is just part of what I do. I work with a lot of, data on a daily basis. I use different, essentially automated tools to surface perhaps the most threatening, narratives coming out of the CCP or the Kremlin, right? And one thing that I do want to share here is that just take a moment to see what's on the slide. And essentially, what you're seeing here is key stories about Taiwan that we are seeing online, right? And how essentially the CCP is trying to frame Taiwan's independence, right? And if you look at the little square on the top right corner, is actually indicating a lot of different social media platforms where these conversations are taking place. To me, this is a very interesting sort of trick to consider, because there are a lot of social media platforms, a lot of different apps that people use to share information and etc. Right? And to me, the reason that data science is becoming so important for information warfare is that you get to essentially understand all the main battlegrounds, right? Where this information, fighting is taking place, right? So you show up in the right battleground to push back, perhaps, if we can get our act together, right? And not only that, if you see, some of the content on the bottom left corner carefully, right? You really see what kind of content the CCP is trying to push, right? Especially on Western social media. To me, this is interesting and important because now that we can actually see the kind of themes and topics they are attacking, right? And perhaps our counter messaging or our proactive messaging will target their vulnerabilities. Essentially, will show up properly to fight back, as opposed to always pushing out the same messages over and over again. So it really helps us calibrate how we can fight back. So this is just one example, and I can tell you, like, if I walking for a day, right? Taiwan is really like, the hot button that we need to continue to push. So like, you can imagine, like, you can see how many times it's being mentioned, like, the temporal variation of these conversations. And the reason I'm talking about Taiwan is actually very, intentional. I think a lot of us, know that, Xi Jinping, made this pledge to essentially annex or reunite with Taiwan by 2025, right? And so far, right, a lot of times, that has been some of the key issue, for us as well, right? And to me, the more we push back, because the first, like, opening salvos will always be information, right? And if we can push back and invalidate, CCP propaganda about Taiwan, we can really, like, prolong, if not delay, Xi Jinping's pledge to reunite with Taiwan. And I think that matters, right? I think, legitimacy matters a lot, especially in the Chinese Communist Party, right? And if Taiwan survives, right, that is essentially a victory for the entire world as far as I'm concerned, right? And then, we can start, like, pushing back a little bit. Let me take up, let me pause here for a quick second because I see a lot of questions. And somebody asked me, hey, what kind of software are you using? I'm not going to name names here because I'm doing this as a private citizen, as a concerned citizen, right? So, but there are tons of, OSINT tools out there, right? And one thing that I do want to encourage you to look into is that, so don't hold this against me, but, the State Department has the Global Engagement Center. And it's got a lot of mixed reviews, but however, they do have this cool, like, resource called Disinfo Cloud, and they essentially list a lot of OSINT solutions that people can use, and also the RAND Corporation. So just Google RAND Corporation, and then, like, Disinfo, like, tools. They have a good catalog of, like, commercially or, like, freely available OSINT software, right? So that's what I would recommend. And like, in terms of, like, commercial solutions, if you just, like, Google social listening tools or social media analytic tools, you can easily surface like, a lot of, existing tools. And of course, some of our government agencies, have contracts with these, vendors as well. All right, so another good question. What tips do you have for encouraging individuals to identify misinformation and recognize attempted malign influence? That's a toughie. The reason I say that's toughie is that, there are, a couple of dynamics that disinformation is really good at exploiting. One is confirmation bias, right? And the other one is essentially social proof, right? So essentially, we don't want to be proven wrong, right? And whenever we have doubt, we go back to our like-minded, like, online tribes, right? Echo chambers, so to speak, to validate whatever we believe in. So, like, there is one thing that I encourage, especially when I talk to, especially parents or, like, young professionals, and that is, there are a lot of good, freely available, media bias, metrics out there, right? So, like, I have a very simple, rule for myself, and that is, look, if it's on the, like, top, like, left 20%, I'm not going to share that with anyone, right? If it's on the other side of the spectrum, right, far right 20%, I'm not going to share that, right? And also, there are a lot of, reliability measures out there, right? Whether it's mostly factual or whether it is mostly misleading, right? So I think, until we come up with more ecosystem level solutions, it really boils down to the individual's willingness to use some third-party solutions to contextualize what they are consuming in the information environment. And I think we'll get there. Some of, one of my favorite, projects that I'm sort of, involved in is, whenever I see a nice bag of potato chips, I know it's not healthy, right? But it's so tempting. They taste so good, right? And then I see the nutrition table on the back of the bag, right? And I really, holy crap, this is mostly saturated fat. There's nothing good for me in that bag of potato chips. So perhaps, instead of eating 2 bags, perhaps I will eat just half a bag and seal it back, right? Because now I have that, context of that food I'm consuming. I do think that, we need that kind of systemic, solution soon, because let me just, dwell on this a little bit, because this topic is so important to me, so critical for, and, this relates to, what I'm doing on a daily basis, right? And there is a lot of conversations out there about like, hey, we need to improve digital, literacy. We need to, empower cyber, citizenship, or essentially, data hygiene, education. Yes, they're very important. They're all very important, right? And they, we will get there, but those endeavors will take a lot of time, right? I always tell, my colleagues that, trying to make fools smart is a fool's errand, right? Yes, critical thinking is paramount, right? It's really important, right? But we cannot turn gazillions of people into critical thinking in the next 2 or 3 years. That's just not going to happen. Even if we make every American super critical of the information they're consuming, what about the rest of the world? Disinformation spreads just like a virus, right? It's always going to attack, compromise body politics, right? And it's going to find essentially incubators. It'll find compromised carriers. And even if our homeland is completely, vaccinated or inoculated, let's just put it that way. Let's just say we have this, information herd immunity through critical thinking and digital, literacy, right? Still, we're going to be surrounded by, oceans of malign influence, right? So this is why I think it's twofold. We need to do both. We need to do both. But I will say that, right? Of course, we didn't, get rid of obesity with this nutrition table. But I guarantee you, we lowered our nation's level of obesity quite a bit, right? So there will be some systemic effects. I don't think we can ever destroy disinformation. In fact, I think the very notion of, hey, we need to remove disinformation is very dangerous, right? Because, once, who's going to adjudicate what is disinformation and what is not, right? And this is why we have so many heated conversations about content moderation and, censorship and free speech right now. So to me, any centralized solutions to essentially determine what is misleading or not, goes against some of the most fundamental principles of our nation. And to me, we need to really focus on empowering the individual, right? And, people share crappy information in, chat apps or private, Facebook groups, because they don't have that context to understand what they are consuming in the information environment. And this is what I mean by social proof, right? And, confirmation bias, because they see something and there's no context behind the story, right? What's the first thing we do? We copy and paste into our favorite, private Facebook group, right? And expecting some kind of, group validation of what I believe in, because that information didn't have any contextual, essentially contextualization in the first place. So to me, yes, digital literacy is important. Promoting critical thinking is important, right? And then, in fact, we have really good, examples, especially from Norway, Finland, right? They started teaching digital literacy really, really early on, right? From kindergarten, or even from essentially childcare, programs, right? They started this 10 years ago, right? We don't have 10 years to spend on this kind of problems right now, because, by 2028, I don't think, we're like where we'll end up in 2028. So I think, again, there is some urgency to take into account. Let's move on. I've been yammering for a while. So slide, please. So again, staying on the Taiwan example, and again, this is some of my favorite screenshots, because from the previous slide, we saw that Reddit was the main battleground, right? In terms of how Chinese trolls, or essentially sock puppets are attacking Taiwan's independence, right? So now I know where to get in, right? I know where I need to fight in, right? And then also, we see a lot of essentially content in this case, right? And who's pushing out, what kind of essentially, CCP affiliated, newspapers are amplifying what stories and whatnot, right? And of course, I think, what's really interesting here is that, I hope we have some participants from India here, because, what's really interesting to me on this slide is that India is getting in, right? And is swinging really hard in support of Taiwan, right? Because of course, they had this, border dispute, right? With China, with the PLA not too long ago, right? So now India is all about, hey, we're going to support Taiwan, right? And to me, if you're not paying attention to this kind of real-time data analytics, right, we're going to miss out on a lot of emerging positive opportunities, right? And to me, it is really amazing how India is essentially going after the CCP, especially on anything pertaining to Taiwan, right? And this is great news, right? Because we don't have to do this by ourselves, right? So we can find our true friends in the battleground, right? And that is, in this case, that happens to be the information environment, right? Slide. Another example, this time I'm looking at different stories that the Chinese affiliated accounts are sharing about Xinjiang, and this time I cannot disclose exactly what kind of data I'm using, but I'm also using a lot of local data sources, and this is really interesting, right? And let's just appreciate what we have on the slide a little bit, right? And that is, yes, well, this is taking place in Reddit, right? And essentially we see a lot of pro CCP accounts and the outlets essentially trying to delegitimate Uyghur human rights activists. It has become even more intense in recent weeks, right? Because if you look at the essentially what's going on between the CCP and BBC, right? Because BBC has been, one of the, pioneering media outlets exposing all the genocidal campaigns taking place against Uyghurs in Xinjiang and elsewhere, right? So, we can see that, oh, interesting. So the CCP is feeling really uncomfortable with essentially external media outlets highlighting, human rights issues in Xinjiang, right? But at the same time, this is, where I'm going to get a little bit, Machiavellian and also crafty. What this slide is showing is that, they're really, afraid of essentially, there is a palpable, and widely shared fear of ethnic conflict, right, inside the mainland, right? And again, it is really gut wrenching to see what's happening in Xinjiang, right? In terms of human rights violations, right? Concentration camps, right? Forced re-education programs, right? Essentially also forcefully migrating, Han people to change the overall demographic dynamics in Xinjiang, right? I mean, it's just straight up awful stuff, right? But from a strategic viewpoint, right, I think we should continue to press on the Uyghur issue, right? On humanitarian, for humanitarian purposes. But at the same time, we know that this is an existential fear for a lot of Chinese officials and Chinese citizens as well, right? it's a hot button for them, right? So like, whether you are a tree-hugging liberal, right, or you are essentially a warmongering hawk, right? To me, like, there's no doubt that we need to continue to press the CCP on the, Uyghur issue, no doubt about it, right? But also there are some additional elements that are really interesting for me from this snapshot, and that is, there are certain terms that the CCP is not censoring, right? If you look at some of the local, data bits, right? And there are a lot of conversations about essentially like labor issues, right? And then perhaps like also like gender issues, right? Or like economic opportunities for women, right? And to me, this tells me that there are some elements that we can perhaps like amplify, or we can just shed light on some of these emerging grievances, right? That may not be like consistent with our imagination of what China is, right? But that's one of the main benefits of using data analytics, right? It essentially, guides us to the right place to start our own strategic messaging. If we were to, return the favor, right? So the CCP will be more preoccupied with internal affairs as opposed to Taiwan or the South China Sea, right? Or the Arctic, right? And whatnot, right? And to me, this is why, again, I think I alluded to this earlier. What is some of the best ways we can compete against the CCP, right? Just make it so internally obsessed, right? It has no time to invade Taiwan. It has no time to build more bases in the South China Sea, right? It has no time to do anything more in South America, right? In terms of helping them build COVID, vaccine manufacturing, bases and whatnot, right? And to me, this is why the information environment is so critical for great power competition. Of course, when I say information environment, I'm defining it very broadly. It includes cyber, includes social media, includes PAI, publicly available information, and etc. Right? And I don't think we can impose a lot of immediate, disproportionate costs on the CCP elsewhere, right? I mean, what are we going to do with the space domain, right? Essentially build the Death Star. That's not going to happen in the next 3-4 years, right? Anything big, right, takes time to develop and takes time to buy, right? And to me, this is why I'm that convinced that, if we want to reverse the clock, so to speak, if you want us to earn back, right, the 75 years that we've lost in the past 20 years, right? We don't have a lot of options. Slide. And even though the CCP is very aggressive in the region and elsewhere, right? There are like there is local resistance to what the CCP has done, right? I mean, to me, like the CCP is a quintessentially global colonial power, right? Unlike us, they depend on global trade a lot more than, perhaps we have one of the most insulated economies in the world, right? We'll be fine even if we don't trade too much. Trust me, we still do a lot of agriculture. We still have a lot of resources. In fact, I think we are the largest oil producer at this point, right? To me, like, the CCP relies on resources in the rest of the world quite a bit to fuel its economy and to keep its rising middle class happy with its political arrangements, right? That means it'll stay a global colonial power, right? And like any other global colonial power, they do make a lot of mistakes, right? They make tons of racist mistakes, right? If you think about Africa, right? I mean, there are tons of gated communities where essentially rich Chinese people live, and outside is all ghetto, right? So like, they're making a lot of mistakes too. And the movie Mulan was a good example of this, right? I mean, they, made a lot of scenes, for this movie in Xinjiang, right? And of course, it didn't help that the lead actress made several statements in support of the new national security law imposed on Hong Kong to crack down on the pro-democracy movement, right? So, if you're curious about this case study, look up Milty Alliance, right? And also you can see some of the pictures, right? There are tons of memes going on out there, right? And there is essentially a lot of grassroots, resistance to, the CCP's, colonialist, propaganda, not only in the region, but also, globally, right? And again, these are opportunities for us, right? But, opportunities are opportunities if you find them, right? And if you know how to essentially take advantage of them. And this is what kind of like, pains me a little bit, at least, from my sort of, technical, viewpoint, the CCP is as vulnerable as, we are, right? They make as many mistakes as we have, right? The only difference is that, they know how to surface our vulnerabilities. They use a lot of, data-driven solutions to exacerbate our internal, device, right? And essentially, we're not returning the favor at this point, right? So, slide. Okay, let me take a quick, break here because I see a lot of, questions.
Hey, Doowan, if you don't mind, I'll feed you some questions if you want to wrap up your slides. We've got a lot of questions, and that way you don't.
Okay, right. So let me try to wrap up. Yeah, let me try to wrap it up in the next like 5 minutes, and then we can do a little bit more about that.
Yes.
Okay. So, in conclusion, I think that's when, that's what Lumpy was really trying to tell me, because he told me that he'll intervene if I'm going too long. So I'll try to wrap it up. So like, you can read the slides. I'm not gonna like, read off the slides, but, let me just describe, what you're seeing on the right side of the slide. Essentially, that's a heat map of the region. You can recognize the countries, right? And this time, what I am surfacing is, who's talking about, Hong Kong in the region, right? And of course, this time it's about the pro-democracy movement, right? And I've been doing this for a long while. I've been tracking, how different communities or different countries addressing the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement. And essentially it's a heat map. Everybody knows a heat map, right? So, the harder it is, the more people are talking about it. And of course, Hong Kong is the hardest part because it's about, the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. But you see a lot of other areas, right? And to me, this is how you find your true friends, right? You pick a topic, right? See, how they're talking about it. Technically it's all possible, right? And now I think, what you want to do is, you re-employ perhaps your technical and human sensors, right? See who's talking about, in what fashion about the topic that matters to our national security priorities, right? And see if you can find any local influencers or local movements that we can sort of help, support, enable, and empower, right? And this is all possible, right? And I think one thing that I do want to repeat here is that this is the main battleground. There's no doubt about it, right? And the CCP is not some 10-foot tall giant in the information environment. They make mistakes. Like I said earlier, the only difference is that we don't exploit their mistakes, right? So, so somebody said China will fail. I hope so, but I will say this much: hope is not strategy, right? And hope takes time, and we cannot afford a lot of time right now. Slide. So I do want to make some concrete, recommendations, and that is especially given this audience, I do want to make some very strategic recommendations, and that is, look, I think I've said it before, right? I hate how people describe information operations or psychological operations. It's always described as in support of some primary operations. To me, that is really something we need to change. That's the wrong mindset. Information operations are the primary operations, right? Because where else can you, essentially engender, maximum effects right now, right? So to me, we have to essentially accept that, this is the primary operation, and then we can use the other domains in support of essentially information statecraft, right? In fact, that's what ISIS did, right? Essentially, whenever they, try to, mount an attack, you always see a bunch of kids running around with cameras, video cameras and so on and so forth, because what they really need is propaganda material for recruitment, right? For essentially for sustainment, to solicit donations and put that content on as many social media platforms and so on and so forth. That is the primary operation. And I think this fundamental mind change is really important, right? And again, to do so, right, I think we need to really integrate open source intelligence, right? Let's just be honest, we have this tendency to essentially look at OSINT as some kind of bastard, right? We prioritize SIGINT, right, setInt, right, geoInt, right? But when it comes to OSINT, we always have, oh, that's OSINT, we cannot verify it, right? Trust me, I've supported a lot of sensitive, activities overseas and so on and so forth. What I can find with OSINT is almost always more accurate than, what they can find with their so-piped inter-collection, procedures, right? Also, there is this matter of scale and parity, right? Oh, somebody really wants to believe that China will fail. I hope so too. Anyway, so a lot of times I think, we become much better at this, especially if for those who are intimately familiar with, what we did against ISIS in the cyber and information domains, right? Unilaterally, we can do this, right? For a small number of adversaries, right? We have proven to ourselves that, we can do this really well, right? At a really high tempo, right? Interagency coordination, deconfliction, whatnot. Yeah, we've done it, right? That's not the problem though, right? Because we are unable to enable and support our allies and essentially partner nations in the information environment. And I'll give you a very good example. I was supporting a small, soft team overseas, and they were trying to help them with their own soft capacity building, right? And what do? We're trying to teach them how to do small unit tactics, right? We're trying to teach them how to snipe, how to parachute, right? Commando stuff, right? And one day I was having dinner with some of their senior leaders, and this is after a few bottles of wine, and one of the generals whispering to my ears, and we don't have any planes to jump off from, right? Can you help us with, an information warfare cell or something like that, right? That's what they're asking us to help them with, right? A lot of these small countries don't even have good airplanes to jump from, right? So there is that, right? So we need to really try to push this capability, forward, and also to our allies and partners, right? And again, last recommendation, right? I've shown you a lot of screenshots that from some of the tools I use myself, right? And I gotta tell you, tech companies are much better at building these tools. They're much faster. They can iterate, they can experiment much faster, right? And this is why we have DIU. This is why we have In-Q-Tel, right? We need to scale those acceleration programs, right? And I don't think we're doing too bad, right? Because I was just reading a news article earlier today that now, a lot of soft teams have forward deployed data scientists, right, and data engineers. So we're getting there, right? I just hope that we'll do more of it at scale. And I just really pray that we'll have enough time to reverse the asymmetry. With that, remark, I'll stop here and then take some questions.
All right. Absolutely great presentation. You have the audience intrigued and excited with more questions than we're going to be able to answer here today. I will put out to the audience, it's not uncommon that you want to get a hold of the presenters. You feel free to shoot me an email if you want, and I'll be happy to get you in contact with Doowan. Doowan, you can come back on up with your video and your audio.
Yeah. Mine. It was getting kind of dark, so I had to turn the light.
Oh, okay. So I'll shift gears on you a little bit. One of the questions says, we talked a lot about China and Russia here so far today, but I'm curious to hear about how North Korea fits into your research. Does North Korea utilize cyber domains for its nuclear weapons programs or development? And is there any thoughts that you might have on what can be done about that?
That's a really quick, good question. That's a great question, and also a really tough question to answer, especially in this open forum. Yes, it is a major problem set. Something that I'm a little bit familiar with. In fact, I'm actually doing a project with a national lab and a federal government agency on essentially how disinformation or cyber operations may be undermining our non-proliferation efforts overseas, right? And the reason being, especially with encrypted chat apps or deep websites or dark websites, right? I can tell you this much, other than the nuclear warhead, you can build a nuclear weapon just using open source intelligence on 3D printing schematics, right? You can buy all these materials in dark websites, right? I mean, so other than the nuclear material, right? You can build an entire nuclear weapon, right? Using nothing but, cyber, essentially an intelligence collection or using, social engineering to solicit information from certain engineers. And so we've seen a lot of indications of this already. And of course, because of all the sanctions we have put on North Korea, that has been one of the primary means of acquiring key know-hows and technical, details of building, weapons of mass destruction for North Korea. So yes, it's a massive problem set. And, we are much better at detecting these threats on the cyber domain. Actually, we're pretty good when it comes to cyber warfare. We're pretty good. People just don't hear about all the great things we do as much as, when we are attacked, right? However, what we're not doing so well is essentially, understanding how unconventional weapons information is blatantly shared on social media platforms and etc. Right? And this is also, I do want to add a caveat because I don't want to sound like holier than thou, because it goes both ways, right? Because it can be a means that we can use perhaps to, in terms of training people in person, right? So I'm a little bit torn about this question, just to be honest with you, Lumpy, right? Because I see so much potential of using it ourselves, right? However, once you open the floodgate, right, it's going to be really hard to control the inevitable proliferation. So again, I think the jury is still out there. Yes, it's a huge problem set. Yes, the DPRK has exploited those domains for its WMD programs, right? In terms of where we clamped it down, I'm still debating. So, I'll leave it there.